The POISE mnemonic stands for Personal Orientation to an International Student Experience. It was BPP University's response to an HEA change initiative in 2012 around internationalisation, but we did want to broaden the definition of the international student experience to include all students, given that all students now are learning within an international context, not least that they are surrounded, of course, by international students. Our original idea was a very big one, and to be honest, we got rather carried away. We ended up exploring all the resources that were currently available, all of the problems that students had, and found pretty much possible solutions for everything. But it really did turn into a mammoth project, and we realized that we would have to greatly limit our expectations. As a consequence, we decided to go right back to some of the fundamental beliefs that students have, which are perhaps more evident with international students, but are there, of course, in all learners. So we followed the lead of the scholarship that exists already around epistemological beliefs, mostly done in the US, which has produced some interesting binary concepts. Some notion of learning as being quick or not at all. I'm going to get it or I'm never going to get it. It's reflected in the notion that learning is quick or not at all, quick learning under Schoenfield's in literature in 83. The idea of authority or reason, so knowledge is either handed down by authority or perhaps derived as a result of careful reasoning. This is reflected in work by Perry. That learning is innate or acquired. So the ability to learn is something that I don't have to learn to learn. I can do it or I can't do it. That's reflected in work by Dweck and Leggett. Whether learning is simple or complex. Is knowledge basically essentially a simple concept? Is it a simple construct, or is it inherently very complex? Also reflected in work by Perry. And finally, the notion of knowledge as being certain or tentative. So this is work which we believed represented a very firm scholarship foundation for us to then develop other resources. But we also recognized that the questions that we were asking were inevitably quite complex, used quite complex language. And so it was decided to try and simplify those binary concepts into POISE questions, questions which one could facilitate a question with students and faculty, the idea of using it in a personal tutorial context or in a small tutorial group setting. Could you ask students these particular questions? Is work hard enough? Who has the answers? Who is responsible for my learning? Is there a simple answer? Is there always a right answer? And exploring those questions were effectively engaging in that dialogue between these binary concepts. It also produced the first of our mnemonics, that knowledge had pace, was ownership, innate, simplicity, and notion of exactness. We then ran a series of workshops based around these questions and explored all the existing literature available to us, as well as exploring some of our own conversations with other tutors. And we basically came up with some student responses which we recorded in the workshop, usually audio recordings. But effectively we ended up producing a series of animations with voiceovers for these. And these became the basis of the key resource around the POISE site. So I'm just going to let some of those play for you now. Some examples of dialogues that students have had around some of these questions.
I came here to learn. If there isn't a right answer, what's the point?
We're learning. We're learning how to think for ourselves.
Yes, I do want to learn for myself, but I also need to know things. I need facts. I need to know what is.
There must be a right answer.
Why? Some things are dependent on the situation.
Yes, in some subjects. But in most of my classes, there are right and wrong answers. If you get it wrong, then other things don't work.
Like what?
Well, I have to get all the maths calculations right, or the bridge I'm building will fall down.
What do you mean there isn't a right answer?
Well, it is a matter of opinion, isn't it? It depends on whether you believe Group A is right or Group B is right.
But what does the tutor think? Does he think it's A or B?
Why does it matter what the tutor thinks?
My tutorial group is arguing about the presentation we have to do next week.
What are you arguing about?
Half the group thinks that we should be describing all the different complex actions. And the other half want to agree on the answer. Like there's one answer.
Is there an answer to the problem?
I don't think so.
So one of the obvious questions is, why did we use animations? Well, essentially the difficulty was that students didn't feel able to express some of their own explicit views and be identified. There was simply too much, too self-conscious in the process. But also we were concerned that perhaps students who could be clearly identified and be lumped together ethnically might then raise all sorts of presuppositions that faculty would have or other students would have. There's an expectation that American students are very engaged, very talkative in class, perhaps dominate class, that students perhaps from the Far East are very timid, less willing to engage. And so we wanted to effectively try and remove as much of the ethnic dimension to the responses. And so that was another good reason for using different characters, different voices to try and replace perhaps the real voices, so that we got away from some of those assumptions that people were making. We felt that the reason for asking these questions was fairly self-evident, that essentially it allows a development of understanding between the individual and a tutor, or between developing understanding between students, and indeed metacognition for the individual student themselves, that they would actually learn to understand the foundations, their own epistemological foundations. But the dialogue, particularly between students, was seen as a means of building relationships around what are very simplistic questions but have profound implications. It produces an opportunity for dialogue. It's a basis for a tutorial dialogue to take place. And finally, we believe that it would actually empower learning, for learners to understand that learning, which is not something we generally teach in higher education, learning in itself is an exploration, it is a journey. We need to provide faculty with the support in order to implement these questions. And so one of the techniques was to derive some scenarios and to illustrate very different types of students that represent the very diverse communities that we now work in. We have students from different ethnic groups, different ages, different learning contexts, and the intention was to represent some of these in a scenario situation and then ask faculty to respond to them. So we did that by running a number of workshops. I've held workshops at the University of Gloucestershire and at Newman University in Birmingham, and essentially the answers are these sought for these same 5 key questions. So working in small pairs or in small teams, the faculty are asked to pick 2 of those individuals on the previous slide to have a conversation about what the perception of those answers might be, which are inherently problematic, which is designed that way, so it's likely to produce some argument between faculty about what those answers are likely to be, and to then try and identify 3 themes. And we've provided some of those resources available freely on the web, so anyone can download that workshop outline, and indeed there is a guidance available for individual faculty that might want to run a similar exercise actually with their tutees in a tutor group. It's not likely to be using paper in a dialogue one-to-one situation, but for a small group tutorial it might be appropriate, so we provided a handout.